Right. Well, welcome,
Thank you.
Gail.
Thanks.
Welcome to the Healthy Brain, Healthy Mind podcast. I'm Dr. Jay Kumar. Gail knows me, and I know Gail. And we're very excited. I'm very excited to have you as our last episode in this four-part series on the Healthy Brain, Healthy Mind podcast. And it really is an opportunity for us to talk about mental health. And I think the importance of mental health. And I always ask, I'm going to introduce you formally in a bit, but I'll just start off by saying that we really here at the Fish Interfaith Center and at Chapman really we want to recognize how spirituality and faith and one's sense of purpose and meaning are core components for our mental health and well-being, which is why we're excited to have you here talking about that. So I would like to let everyone know that Gail, because we work together, we're professionally, we're also friends. So that's why we're on a first name basis. So both Dr. Stearns and I both work here at the Fish Interfaith Center. And a little bit about our guest today. Dr. Gail Stearns is the Dean of the Wallace All Faiths Chapel and Associate Professor of Religious Studies and in Peace Studies here at Chapman. She's also an ordained minister of the Presbyterian Church. Gail holds an interdisciplinary PhD from Washington State University with emphasis in gender theory. Dr. Stearns works with students, faculty, and staff at Chapman University through Chapman's beautiful Wallace All Faiths Chapel. She fosters interfaith celebration and gatherings, as well as academic conversations in the areas of faith and religion. These include such topics as the scientific and religious study of consciousness and conversations in religious and economics. Dr. Stern's most recent work is as a teacher of mindfulness, a meditation that cultivates present awareness, helps to reduce anxiety, and fosters compassion. She offers mindfulness meditation here at Chapman and also in the community. So welcome, Gail.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Thank you. So I want to ask you, just kind of get a better sense of who you are. I always open with people's stories. I always find that hearing people's stories, especially when it comes to our journey towards how we begin to be who we are, is what drew you into chaplaincy and interfaith work? Is there a specific story?
Well, of a story. I always grew up in a church first, and then really finding what I found when I got to college is I loved studying theology, and I did a lot of traveling. And what I learned was that religious communities, faith communities, church communities were just where my heart was building community. And it felt to me that this was a good place to do it. Within kind of the at the time within the church, that was a good place to build community. And that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to build community and help people find meaning in their lives. So it was some years later, I would say one moment that kickstarted me into interfaith, which I bet there are many people that would say this, and that was 9/11. I was a campus pastor up at Washington State University. I'd finished my PhD and I ran the campus ministry program. And, when 9/11 happened, suddenly the university was calling me and an interfaith group we'd had for many, many years, but more informally, all of the leaders in the community to say, what are we going to do? What should we do? We don't know what to do. And so we helped the university and the city to decide and to kind of, for about 6 months, walk through many rituals and support of the Muslim community. And that really kickstarted me to say, this is crucial work in our world today. So from then on, I began to do much more interfaith work.
Well, that's a wonderful, I think we all have experiences and circumstances in our lives that guide us on this journey. And I think, you and I talk about this idea. It's actually a concept from Parker Palmer, Let Your Life Speak. Gail and I used to teach the happiness course together, and I unfortunately missed her because I teach it solo now. But one of the books that we have used in that class is by Parker Palmer, who is a Quaker minister and author and teacher, who really has this idea of the journey, this idea of vocation calling. Right. So this idea of journey and calling is something that is a core aspect, I think, of what drives us to a sense of purpose and meaning. And so when it comes to mental health, and how do you feel that what role does one's faith or spiritual identity play in our mental health?
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that you use the word calling, because that's the way I understand my profession, my vocation. In the church, we talk about being called to the ministry, and it's something that we feel is, in a sense, is called both a divine calling, but also the community calls us. So we get you don't get ordained unless you're affirmed by the community. So that's your calling to serve the community. So that word is really important. I find people at the university don't use that word very much. But to me, one way to think about it is that it is really about finding what your deeper vocation is, and often rooted in your faith, your ethics, your faith, your values. Who do you serve is really an important question for people to ask, rather than just what am I going to do to serve. So yeah, I feel like I've been disappearing from the screen. Did you notice
okay.
that?
It
Is that
happens.
okay?
Yeah.
So anyway, it's like it comes and goes. So anyway, so I that's a really important concept to me, is the concept of call, and it often comes from faith. It comes from our understanding of who we are in relation to the community, to the earth, to the divine.
Mm-hmm. You know, one core component of this idea of calling and vocation is the idea of sometimes we have to traverse the journey, like the dark night of the soul, you know, the journey into darkness, if you will. And, you know, one thing that I have found in my journey, I share this openly in my book and also in the very first podcast, is the death of my mother to suicide was a journey into darkness, but it was also part of my vocation and calling. And the idea is that we really can sometimes grow from adversity. We can grow from grief. Have you found in your journey that sometimes your perhaps crisis, in moments of crisis, it's kind of forged a deeper sense of identity and purpose and calling and meaning in your life?
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of interesting design of human beings, but I've absolutely found that it's through tragedy and through difficulty that I have grown stronger and wiser, and been through you know, deaths of people close to me, and just really difficult circumstances. And there's no question that that's the moment that you really have to stop and think about what it is you believe, what is foundational. It's a time that has really formed me every single time, and I've come out in a way a different person. And I see that in the students I work with, that it's those are the times they stop and think and begin to grow and get deeper.
Yeah, you know, sometimes I use this analogy that sometimes when a bone breaks, it becomes stronger.
Yep, absolutely.
I think the same. Do you think the same holds true to our spirit, our psyche?
I think it does, if you have the resources and the support to do that. I think there are people that mental health is one issue. If you're, you know, or physical health, if it's more fragile, you may not have the resources to do that. If you have the community, if you have the support, if you have the ability to find those resources, there's no question. I think for some people, I'm not one of these people that says, you know, that there's nothing that can break us, because there are things, and especially if we don't have support. So that's the most important part.
Yeah. You know, you bring up the topic of today's podcast is ready, resilient, and reflective.
Yeah.
And how can we become more, grow and find a sense of purpose and well-being through adversity and change and challenges, you know, especially what's going on right now, not just with COVID, but, you know, last episode, we had a great conversation on racial trauma and social justice. And there are many dimensions that we experience trauma. What do you think given your connection to working with interfaith and working with people's spiritual, religious identities, what do you think the trauma has done to impact? Do you think people have maybe questioned faith, or questioned a sense of using spirituality, maybe put in the positive, using spirituality as a way, as a resource to cope with trauma and challenges. Have you found that to be the case in the people you've worked with?
Absolutely. And I'm observing it, interestingly, as you are, in watching a lot of the racial justice work going on, that today there's a sense in which if you can kind of go, in a sense, to the practices that are really historic for your people, whoever that happened to be, whether it's chanting, whether it's prayer, whether it's meditation, whatever that is, that it sort of awakens the soul. And there's no question that those are practices, and as you and I have talked about, can really shift even the way you are in the world. They shift the way your brain works. I mean, these kinds of repetitive, habitual practices are found in every tradition, in every spirituality, in every faith, and in many, many ancient practices, and they're becoming invaluable for people to gain resilience.
Yeah. I think I'm going to pick up on this, a story I shared, at the beginning of the pod, but also the very first episode. Having lost my mother to suicide was certainly a traumatic experience in my life. But what people don't know, I think you know this, the year before I started graduate school at UCLA, I decided that I had an opportunity to travel. And so I went backpacking around Asia. Yeah. And found myself in India, which is my ethnic, roots. And I was drawn to be in an ashram. For many people who don't know what an ashram is, it's a spiritual place where people come and really dive deeper into the specific traditions of that lineage. And so I found myself for almost a month in this ashram in India. And it was there I first discovered and reconnected to my ancient spiritual contemplative roots in meditation and yoga. I say this because flash forward, this is the year before I started my PhD program at UCLA. And then the summer after my first year is when my mother passed away. And I still to this day believe that if I didn't have the foundations for meditation and learning the tools and the inner cognitive resources to help me in the face of tragedy, I just don't know. I mean, don't get me wrong, I still suffered a great amount of trauma and depression and anxiety in the aftermath of that. But to me, it's almost like where faith and spirituality, and this is a nice segue into mindfulness, it's almost like, how do we begin to build what I call a cognitive safety net? Like the word resilience means to bounce back. So how, this is a good segue into the work that you do around mindfulness. I know you have a book coming out, and we'll talk about that just a bit. But how were you drawn into mindfulness, if I may ask, the practice of it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I was working in this kind of chaplaincy, campus ministry, and I was able to be introduced to a number of people from different faiths who do contemplative practice. And I began to study that more. And I began to practice, what I practiced was centering prayer, which is really within Christianity. I learned that. I met and got to study with Father Thomas Keating, who kind of brought that back from, the medieval mystics for us today. And I found that it did what you're talking about. It built a kind of resilience. It helped me to learn about kind of be reflective in terms of, it's almost, he calls it divine psychotherapy. So it was sort of like that. Yeah, it's a beautiful term. And I found that, but then I began to work with all these students who, were of different faiths and that kind of thing. So I thought, well, what can I do? And mindfulness was beginning. And so I took my first mindfulness-based stress reduction course the year before I came to Chapman. So that was 11 years ago. And I was stunned because it was all the things I had learned and experienced, but kind of packaged in an easier way to teach, if that makes sense. And a way to sort of say, here's how you go step by step through this. You don't have to just, I think and so I was able to learn that. And then for me, I was able to kind of meld that with centering prayer.
Yeah. We actually had a guest, Dr. Manjari Murali, who was on the second episode. We talked specifically about meditation.
Yeah.
We talked more about the science and the brain science of meditation, but I want to talk to you about how mindfulness meditation can really be a tool and resource to perhaps build greater compassion or empathy. Do you find that? Well, first, I think maybe the question to ask, since this topic really focuses on spirituality.
Yeah.
Can you maybe share with our listeners the origins of mindfulness? Like many people tend to think of it as a secular practice, but it really isn't.
Yeah, no, not at all. In fact, today's what I might call, American mindfulness, or even the classic mindfulness, because mindfulness uses when you Google it, you find. Last time I looked, it was 237 million hits. So there's a lot of definitions out there.
Right.
So anyway, classical mindfulness really is drawn from Theravada Buddhism, from Vipassana Buddhism, and the understanding of how Vipassana Buddhism has taken, and particular lineages within that, have taken the understanding of the Four Noble Truths and really privileged meditation, because not all Buddhist traditions do, as you know, privileged meditation in certain ways and in very simple ways as a kind of pathway to enlightenment. So that the way we understand American mindfulness is kind of a quick path to enlightenment of some kind. I don't think it's enlightenment in the sense of Buddhism, but enlightenment in the sense of awareness. And that's how it's been presented, and then it's been used, as I said, in 237 million other ways.
No, I love you and I want to talk about your book in just a bit as well. Now we'll do a plug here. We teach Gail as well as Professor Artman. We teach a 6-week mindfulness program at the Fish Interfaith Center, and you also teach a 1-credit course. 1.5 credits in there are 2. So Dr. Artman and I teach it. We're both graduates of the UCLA Mindfulness Teaching Center. So we both teach. One teaches the fall, which is the intro to mindfulness. The second semester is advanced and applied mindfulness. And those are credit courses. And so there's an academic component, to mindfulness, also experiential. And we do both here at Chapman, which is really nice. But, I think it's very important for our listeners to be aware that what most people now refer to or practice as mindfulness does have its origins in a very strong, powerful Buddhist, religious tradition. And maybe I'll ask you the question, how do you define mindfulness?
It's fascinating. I don't, and I'll tell you why. I'm writing a book, as you know, which I'm calling it Reclaiming Mindfulness. But what I do is I say I can't define it because there's so many definitions, but I talk about the uses of mindfulness. So the use of mindfulness in the way that I teach it and learned it is what I call classical mindfulness in America, classical American mindfulness. And that is using particular meditative practices to just observe the mind, to observe the body, to observe, thoughts, emotions, all the senses. And, classically mindfulness is defined as being in the present moment with curiosity and kindness. That's kind of basically what it means. You can take that to mean, many things. You can take that to mean eating mindfully so that you're actually paying attention to the food or thinking about the origins of the food you're eating. I mean, there's so many ways you can take that. I think I find if you face the camera, you won't disappear. If I stay facing it.
If you stay facing it.
Okay, so when I turn.
I think when you turn, and
let me go back a little so I don't have to.
We're all. This is all very
really hard.
Very very informal here. But we have the audio, which is really great in terms of for the audio podcast of this. But what I want to ask is, you bring up this term present awareness, which I think is a core component. And I think maybe you can, I know the answers, but I think I'd like for you to share with our listeners. There is a term or a concept that comes out of the Buddhist tradition, comes from the Sanskrit language. The word is called dukkha or dukkha, which sometimes gets translated as this idea of, what's called dissatisfaction.
Just turn this. Can I turn it just a little? Because that way we're both facing. Then I'm going to lose you.
It's all right. It's more about you. I want you to be the one who's fully present on this.
Good.
But this idea of dukkha is we're kind of our minds are actually grounded in this idea of dissatisfaction. And so there's a concept, that word dukkha. We're never satisfied with what is, or sometimes our minds are always drifting into the past or wandering into the future. So how does mindfulness perhaps overcome that powerful biological or neurobiological drive of dissatisfaction?
Yeah, I think what we do is I always say that the premise of mindfulness is that we're not in the present most of the time. Our mind is either in the future or it's in the past. It's spinning a story. So something happens and then we think we begin to spin a story of why and what's going to happen next. And then we spin all these stories, which we really don't know. We just know what happened just now. And we live in those stories and we create a lot of our suffering in those stories. We create the suffering of, I always give the students the example of they send a text to someone they don't know very well, thinking maybe they'd get together with them, and then they don't hear back. What happens? One student even said, she basically said, complete self-esteem crisis, you just fall apart. And that's because you create this story that, oh, they're laughing at me, they don't want to go. Well, you don't know, their phone might not be working. There's a million reasons they didn't text back. So that's what we do is we create, and then we begin to spin stories. With that comes emotions, anxiety, insecurity. With that comes physical, tightness, sensation. We can't eat, we can't sleep. So I think that's what the notion of creating our own suffering by our thinking is about. And we do that all the time. And we can begin to learn to catch it and to notice it and to kind of go, maybe I won't believe that story right now because I just made it up.
Yeah. And I think, I like the fact that you referred earlier on to the Four Noble Truths. That are a core component of Buddhist spiritual, religious, thought. And the first noble truth, as the Buddha proclaimed, is all life is grounded in dukkha, or the sense of suffering, dissatisfaction. And the root cause of this suffering is our failure to understand the impermanence of life. And the third is that there is a way to cease suffering, and that the fourth is the practice of the Eight Noble Truths, which are the Eightfold Path, and the Eightfold Path, of which mindfulness is a core component: mindful thinking, mindful awareness, mindful thoughts, behaviors, actions, etc. So it all goes back to this idea that the Buddha talked about. I always refer to the Buddha as one of the world's first behavioral psychologists. Even though he would never call himself that, because he observed human behavior. And
that's right. He did.
He really did. And the laboratory that he used wasn't the laboratory of an fMRI machine. It was the laboratory of the mind.
That's right.
And the Buddha observed, and what I think, was really when he became enlightened, the word Buddha actually means the one who was awakened. The one who was awakened from the illusion of suffering and the illusion of impermanence. And so this idea, and I think it's a core component, I think we can tie it into what's happening in our world today, is that we need to recognize that everything we've experienced is real. The suffering, the loss, the tragedy, it's part of the human experience. It's embedded into the human equation. But how can we begin to instill practices that can help us recognize how to overcome the trauma, the loss, and the grief? And this is the title, it's like the ready, resilient, and reflective. How do we become ready? What tools can we begin to do, whether it's for our students or for our community? What tools can we begin to apply into our lives to become ready to face a world of maybe uncertainty and change?
I've really thought a lot about this, and I know that you posed some questions before, and I was thinking about this as well for me to reflect on. And part of it is we can begin to do these practices, that are spiritual practices, I think would say one caveat about Buddhism, and that is that American mindfulness, the way people are practicing it, is not Buddhism. It comes from Buddhism. Buddhism, you follow a pathway, you follow the eightfold path. One of those is right mindfulness, right? And the others have to do with what you eat and what your vocation is. And, and also they're extremely disciplined is what I would say. I don't think most of us do that. Most of us just sit and do a little meditation. So we're not practicing Buddhism. I just like to clarify that. And I think that's a little bit of colonization for us to say we are. So it's good to know the roots, but also these practices we're talking about come from that and give us this insight as to how our brains work. And so my sense is if we can take the very simple techniques of mindfulness, but then couple those with whatever our legacy or tradition is. So if you practice centering prayer, I just talked to a young student who was in Israel and met a woman who does Kabbalah and who incorporates mindfulness kind of as a tool. I see it as a technique and a tool. That's the way I see it. So, you can incorporate that. And as we do those, they really help us to develop a sense of not only resilience, but who am I? Who am I related to? How am I related to the divine, to the earth, to other people? They can help me to have this kind of awareness, and also, especially when placed within my own context, whatever that is.
Yeah. So, I like how we tie in these 3 R's, and this is actually the Ready, Resilient, Reflective. It's actually a program we're going to start hopefully launching here at Chapman in the upcoming academic year, and around tools around spiritual well-being and resilience and thriving as well. And it really is important because, I think I'd like to ask you the question is, we talked about how to become ready and resilient, but the reflective piece, how do you, maybe could you speak to what so many of us have experienced this past 15 months during COVID has really allowed us to become more reflective? And, what are some ways in which you maybe have become more reflective during the past year? Maybe ask the last question first. How have you personally become more reflective?
Yeah, I think that it's just given me time. There's been time that I'm not out and about with people and not socializing and not as busy as normal. I mean, we're extremely busy, as you know, and we've been busy on Zoom and all of that. But just having time that we're not rushing around and that kind of thing has given me space to think about. There's this sort of understanding in, I think, the mindfulness world that I'm writing a little bit about, which is that, stress is increasing and inevitable and will always be there. So you all have to, take my course or buy my app in mindfulness. This is how it's advertised. And, it's not inevitable and increasing. We can shift the way we live. We can really have a much more a balanced life. And putting an app on the phone is lovely if it helps, and it helps you sleep. But turning your phone off is really the way to become reflective. And we've gotten to do that more this year. So for me, it's really given me a kind of perspective on that. Plus, the earth began to wake up, because we weren't pouring as much stuff into the atmosphere. And I think the same would begin to happen with some individuals, those who were not, of course, really hit, and in terms of job and food insecurity and all that. I think many people that were not hit with that had an opportunity to stop and reflect.
Yeah, this is not my idea. I heard this someplace else. And in many ways, COVID and the pandemic, it was like an X-ray machine onto humanity. Yeah, it really exposed all the places we were broken,
right,
and diseased. Yeah, whether it's through our relationship with the environment or economic, financial. Food insecurity. I think we have far more respect for frontline workers now, right? And people who are essential workers.
Totally.
I have more respect for the staff here at Chapman, the cleaning staff.
Yeah, they've been here all along.
They never missed a day.
No.
Even when
No.
things were closed, they were here. You know, our food service, Trader Joe's,
Yeah.
the cashiers at Trader
Everything.
Joe's, everything. So this reflection is like, we need to recognize, and this is how I took it from my life, you know, the past 15 months. Reflective was not just inner reflection, it was societal reflection.
Yeah.
Like how we're all united in the sense of loss and trauma, and this idea the COVID pandemic exposed so many places where we as humanity have been broken.
Yeah.
So this kind of segues to, I think, maybe a last, couple questions. I've been doing some, and I want to talk, actually, before I do, I want to talk about your book.
Okay,
So let's
great.
actually do a plug for it. So
Yeah, thank you.
So Reclaiming Mindfulness is the name of the book?
I think so. It's
Okay.
not out yet.
All right.
So that's a
Okay.
working title.
Yeah. Who's the publisher?
Orbis Press.
Orbis
will be
Press.
out. It should be out next fall. So yeah.
This coming fall.
I think either fall or early spring.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
So tell us what
Yeah.
inspired you to write this book? You've written 2 books, I think, before,
Yeah,
right?
three.
Three,
Yeah.
sorry.
Well, edited one, yeah, and written
Okay.
2. I think mostly inspired because we started talking about my journey when I began teaching mindfulness. So I took, I'd already done mindfulness without the word on it, right? I learned it through centering prayer. Then I took mindfulness. I'm like, oh, same thing, but easier, packaged better. And then I began to teach. I entered the UCLA Mindfulness Awareness Research Center and took a course for a whole year to learn to teach, and began to teach. And then in the years since then, so this is in the last 10, 11 years, I have seen what's happened with mindfulness, which is it has become incredibly commodified. It has become, billion-dollar business, billions of dollars, built upon what we started with, which is some Buddhist people who do not sell the teachings of the Buddha, right? And here we're selling the teachings of the Buddha, right? So I just began to think, what's wrong with this picture? And I began to see that it has become one more, it fits too well into American commodification and American, attempts to grab self-help without looking at the causes of what the real problems are, whether it's mental health, whether it's racial injustice, whether it's, gender inequity. It doesn't matter what it is. We don't look at the cause. We just try to grab something to feel better right now about it, right? So it's become one more of those. And that bothers me a little bit. I'm like, this is so much deeper. This can be so transformative of the soul, as you and I have talked about, that it felt like something was wrong. So the book really looks at the uses, talks about what's happened to it, and then really looks at places where it's being used, coupled particularly with specific traditions, and goes deeper. It's not about just self-help and commodification. It's about, I guess I'll say one other thing is that what I see happening is that mindfulness as a tool can be used for anything. You can become a better sharpshooter with mindfulness. Okay, that's the classic thing people say. So your ethics and your values, I think, need to be built first, and then you use mindfulness. And that's what I'm arguing, is that you don't just assume because someone does mindfulness, suddenly their brain shifts, although we know it does a little bit to awaken centers of compassion. But if they don't have any external awareness or values or ethics that other people other than their own group is important, there's nothing in mindfulness to teach them that. You need to actually also have some values and ethics that may come from your faith or your community that actually value social justice, that value other people. Then the tools of mindfulness can be tremendous to help you awaken to how to do that. So I think we're pretending that somehow if everybody was just, was just mindful all the time, we'd all be compassionate. But it's not, we're all coming from different places, values wise, right? And so that's kind of what I'm trying to say is dig into those deep values you already have and use these tools in order to awaken them. Well, I love that you're working on this book. And when you talked about how the commodification of mindfulness is now here, it reminds me what happened with the yoga tradition. Exactly.
Like going back a few decades ago, when yoga was really kind of, when it was introduced here to the West with the Beatles, actually, through Maharishi and the Beatles, it was very much a spiritual
Yes.
focused practice. There was a physical aspect to it as well. But now look where the yoga industry is. It's complete, like, get your yoga body.
Right.
And
Right.
use yoga for athletic training.
That's right.
Whatever
That's
the
right.
case might
When
be.
originally it had nothing to do with movement.
No,
No.
you're right.
Right.
You're right.
It wasn't even incorporated.
No, yoga was really a meditation practice.
It was a meditation
The word
practice.
yoga means union.
That's right.
And if I can just say, in the Yoga Sutras, which go back about 2,500 years ago, and I'll just recite it in the original Sanskrit, yoga chitta vritti nirodha. It's idea. It's a Sanskrit phrase which means translates roughly as yoga is the goal of quieting the turnings of thought.
Yes.
Sounds like
beautiful.
Not like mindfulness.
It does,
doesn't it?
It does. It does. And yet, today, it's aerobic practice. It's all kinds of things. So, and maybe that's not bad. I mean, what I say is that mindfulness is beautiful for stress relief. It works.
Sure.
There's nothing wrong with that. I have no problem with that. What the problem I have is that people think that somehow if you just do that, suddenly the world will be a better place. Where I think we really need to look at our values and ethics and our context. And then utilize the tools toward that, toward the kind of compassion that comes out of our values and our ethics and our context, whether that be spiritual. Many of the spiritual faith traditions, of course, really value caring for the stranger, for example. So how can we use these tools to awaken that even more and to move toward action? I've heard many people talk about, how do we use mindfulness as a tool for justice and action? So just I think it's a beautiful tool for that. I think that it can also be, for daily stress relief. So that's why I say I don't define it, because those are completely different things.
Yeah,
right.
You're right. The goals are different.
The goals are different. And that's kind of what I'm trying to say is we can use this as a real tool for awakening compassion and justice.
So we be on the lookout for Gail's new book, Dr. Stern's new book. I'm sure it'll be announced, and we'll be having probably a book signing for you here at some point. But this kind of gets to something, I think not only are we professionally aligned, we're also friends. Even our research, I think, aligns very strongly. I'm working on a new book myself called America's State of Mind. And the idea is really looking at where we are right now in our national psyche, and looking at the levels of, I think, anger and hate and vitriol, and maybe looking at the levels of injustice and racial trauma. And I was, in part of my research, and it aligns to with this conversation with you, I'm hearing a lot of neuropsychologists talk about how our brains are actually born in, at a very primal level, to kind of always be on this lookout for kind of where there might be threats in our environment. But the good news is that we can overcome it. So we're not hijacked by it. And so I actually was listening to reading over the weekend that they may have isolated a part of the brain that might be predisposed to fear of the other, fear of the unknown. But the good news, so maybe it could be the root causes of bigotry and intolerance and hatred, and people look different or pray different. It's a threat on a primal level. But we also have aspects of our brain, from our, putting my science geek hat on right now, where we can overcome these built-in evolutionary biases that want to see others as threats, where we can elicit our compassionate drive, our empathic drive as well. And this aligns to mindfulness. There's a lot of research coming up right now. In fact, we're doing a study here at the Brain Institute that looks at the effects of our 6-week mindfulness program, how it affects emotional regulation, attention, cognitive performance. But have you found in your research how the practice of mindfulness can be applied on you want to call societal level to help heal collective trauma or racial injustice, or racial trauma or social justice?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is mixed research, as you know, on that. There's a lot of research that says if an individual just sits in mindfulness, if an individual just sits in, their own mindfulness practice, it actually can trigger trauma, and it can actually be really difficult for the person. So it's one of the reasons that I'm critical of of teaching anybody, anytime, anywhere mindfulness, because trauma gets elicited. It's inside of you.
Yeah,
and so it does. And so so teaching individuals may or may not be helpful, to be honest. However, the tools of mindfulness, of beginning to awaken, to be aware, and to be very present, to notice your trauma reactions as a group, as a community, is really can be a very important in terms of becoming aware of our community biases, for example. What are the biases of my group, my community? What are the traumas that my community has been through? And again, I think where I've seen this most powerfully now is some work with racial justice and communities that have been, traditionally, enslaved, and some of the trauma has continued through the centuries. And also those of us who benefit from white body supremacy, as Resma Menachem says, we also suffer from a kind of trauma because of the history of our ancestors. And so really beginning to open to that, to pay attention, to heal, to understand we don't have to hang on to that. We don't have to fear is really important. And I think done in communities with specific goals, it can be incredibly powerful. I think, let alone on its own, sort of loosely with individuals, it may or may not do that, if that makes sense.
Sure.
But I think communities and particular ethnicities, particular spiritualities, particular kind of people with shared histories are using mindfulness tools in really powerful ways.
Yeah, I think it's powerful work.
It is.
We talked about it actually in our last episode, and as a good plug for people to listen to the last episode, looking at how we begin to heal trauma of racial injustice, racial trauma and social injustice. And maybe this is a good segue to our last question, is to really, in your role here as, the Dean of the Wallace All Faiths Chapel and your work you do with interfaith, literacy and education, and really promoting and supporting our Chapman community, what would be some parting words of advice you can give? Because I know a lot of people, since something we're talking about is like that rehumanization process, how do we begin to return back into the world after 15 months of trauma, or pandemic trauma? What words of advice might you give, whether from your role as a chaplain or as a dean, might you offer to our community to help re-navigate back into the world again?
Yeah, you use the term spiritual kind of resilience. And the thing that I would say to people is, don't be afraid, because you have the tools within you, right, to be able to understand who you are in the midst of the environment. And don't be afraid to look deeply into your own spirit and kind of understand what your values are, what your ethics are. And then really don't be afraid to find like-minded people as you emerge. Find people that will surround you, that will support you, because it's going to be hard. I mean, I even had this experience this week, and I was suddenly with all these people without masks on, and I found myself really freaked out. And if I may tell one more story, Jay, it was a beautiful, powerful moment. I was at a birthday party for a friend of mine who works in women's prisons, and some of the women who had been released were there, been in prison for 25, 30 years. And they began to talk about what it was like to get out of prison. And some of them said the first time they got in a car, they hadn't been in a car in 25, 30 years, they were nauseated. It was moving. They just hadn't felt that. They picked up a fork at a restaurant and it was metal. They hadn't had a metal fork and knife in 25, 30 years, picked up their cup and it was glass. And the weight felt weird to them. So and they felt, I think the important thing is they also moved into then transition spaces. So they don't just sort of come out and just get thrown out into the street. They went into transition where there are other people who've been released are with them, helping them transition. People who love them are around them. And that's essential for kind of reentry. So I guess that's what I'm kind of saying. Expect some jarring, expect some fear, expect that it might be, that's so extreme. But I think that we we're feeling a bit of that fear, that jarring, oh my gosh, I haven't been in this crowd. There are people that think differently. I feel afraid. Really find a community, and particularly those that can deepen your own sense of who you are and connectedness, your own spirit, your own ethics, your own values, your own morals, and find those people, surround yourself, and they will help you grow stronger and actually be, I think, a much stronger person than you might have been a year and a half ago. Because before, you were just maybe not paying attention to that. You may have just been letting yourself be influenced by negative and positive both, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And I think that's a wonderful analogy and story that you share about the women that you talked to who just were released from incarceration. And it really does. You know, I think it's a good analogy. I like to say this thing, there's this term which is being thrown around right now called pandemic-induced social anxiety.
Right.
On this idea, like now that as we're speaking, just been a few days since the mask wearing has kind of been loosened up, and we're vaccinated here, so we're good over here.
Yeah.
But the idea is that a lot of us are experiencing how to re-navigate that terrain of socialization in the same way that the people who are incarcerated, and not saying we were not physically incarcerated, we were in some ways, you know, I think psychologically incarcerated with quarantine and things as well. And we have to take it easy. We have to realize it's not an off and on switch. It's a dimmer switch. And we just have to take our time. And some people are going to need more time than others to reacclimate.
Right.
I think it's everything you just shared that can be applied into how, again, do we become ready, resilient, and reflective?
Yeah.
Returning back into the world.
Yeah, that's great.
So thank you so much.
Thanks. That was fun.
Yeah. And I would like for all of you to catch all this episode and all previous episodes of this 4-part series on our Fish Interfaith Facebook page and SoundCloud. And hopefully we will resurrect maybe some of these podcasts in the coming academic year.
Sounds great.
Fun. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yep.